The first lieutenant squadron carried, along with a sea chest, his own burdensome story. Perhaps it was of a scorned love, or a secret prison conviction, or a pregnant wife left on shore weeping. Perhaps it was a hunger for fame and fortune, or a dread of death. David Cheap, the rest lieutenant of the Centurion, the squadron's ag ship, was no dia rent, a burly Scotsman in his early 40s with a protracted nose and intense eyes. He was in it, from squabbles with his brother over their inheritance, from creditors chasing him, from debts that made it impossible for him to end a suitable bride. On shore, Cheap seemed doomed, unable to navigate past life's unexpected shoals. Yet as he perched on the quarterdeck of a British man of war, cruising the vast oceans with a cocked hat and spyglass, he brimmed with condescension, even, some would say, a touch of haughtiness. The wooden world of a ship, a world bound by the Navy's rigid regulations and the laws of the sea, and, most of all, by the hardened fellowship of men, had provided him a refuge. Suddenly he felt a crystalline order, a clarity of purpose, and Cheap's newest posting, despite the innumerable risks that it carried, from plagues and drowning to enemy cannon arid what he longed for, a chance to nally claim a wealthy prize and rise to captain his own ship, becoming a lord of the sea. The problem was that he could not get away from the damned land. He was trapped, cursed, really, at the dockyard in Portsmouth, along the English Channel, struggling with feverish futility to get the Centurion tetted out and ready to sail. Its massive wooden hull, 144 feet long and 40 feet wide, was moored at a slip. Carpenters, caulkers, riggers, and joiners combed over its decks like rats, which were also plentiful. A cacophony of hammers and saws. The cobblestone streets past the shipyard were congested with rattling wheelbarrows and horse-drawn wagons, with porters, peddlers, pickpockets, sailors, and prostitutes. Periodically, a boatswain blew a chilling whistle, and crewmen stumbled from shops, parting from old or new sweethearts, hurrying to their departing ships in order to avoid their hawsers' lashes. It was January 1740, and the British Empire was racing to mobilize for war against its imperial rival Spain. And in a move that had suddenly raised Cheap's prospects, the captain under whom he served on the Centurion, George Anson, had been plucked by the Admiralty to be a commodore and lead the squadron of warships against the Spanish. The promotion was unexpected. As the son of an obscure country squire, Anson did not wield the level of patronage, the grease, or interest, as it was more politely called, that propelled many hawsers up the pole, along with their men. Anson, then 42, had joined the Navy at the age of 14, and served for nearly 3 decades without leading a major military campaign or snaring a lucrative prize. Tall, with a long face and a high forehead, he had a remoteness about him. His blue eyes were inscrutable, and outside the company of a few trusted friends he rarely opened his mouth. One statesman, after meeting with him, noted Anson, as usual, said little. Anson corresponded even more sparingly, as if he doubted the ability of words to convey what he saw or felt. He loved reading little, and writing or dictating his own letters less, and that seeming negligence drew upon him the ill will of many, a relative wrote. A diplomat later quipped that Anson was so unknowing about the world that he'd been round it, but never in it. Nevertheless, the Admiralty had recognized in Anson what Cheap had also seen in him in the 2 years since he'd joined the Centurion's crew, a formidable seaman. Anson had a mastery of the wooden world and, equally important, a mastery of himself. He remained cool and steady under duress. His relative noted he had high notions of sincerity and honor and practiced them without deviation. In addition to Cheap, he had attracted a coterie of talented junior hawsers and protégés, all vying for his favor. One later informed Anson that he was more obliged to him than to his own father, and would do anything to oct up to the good opinion you are pleased to have of me. If Anson succeeded in his new role as Commodore of the squadron, he would be in a position to anoint any captain he wanted, and Cheap, who'd initially served as Anson's second lieutenant, was now his right-hand man. Like Anson, Cheap had spent much of his life at sea, a bruising existence he'd at rest hoped to escape. As Samuel Johnson once observed, no man will be a sailor who has contrivance enough to get himself into a jail, for being in a ship is being in a jail, with the chance of being drowned. Cheap's father had possessed a large estate in Fife, Scotland, and one of those titles, the second Laird of Rossi, that evoked nobility even if it did not quite confer it. His motto, emblazoned on the family's crest, was Ditat Virtus, virtue enriches. He had 7 children with his rest wife, and after she died he had 6 more with his second, among them David. In 1705, the year that David celebrated his 8th birthday, his father stepped out to fetch some goat's milk and dropped dead. As was custom, it was the oldest male heir, David's half-brother James, who inherited the bulk of the estate, and so David was booted by forces beyond his control, in a world divided between rest sons and younger sons, between haves and have-nots. Compounding his upheaval, James, now ensconced as the 3rd Laird of Rossi, frequently neglected to pay the allowance that had been bequeathed to his half-brothers and half-sister. Some blood was apparently thicker than others. Driven to lend work, David apprenticed to a merchant, but his debts mounted. So in 1714, the year he turned 17, he ran out to sea, a decision that was evidently welcomed by his family. As his guardian wrote to his older brother, "The sooner he goes, it will be better for you and me." After these setbacks, Cheap seemed only more consumed by his festering dreams, more determined to bend what he called an unhappy fate. On his own, on an ocean distant from the world he knew, he might prove himself in elemental struggles, braving typhoons, outdueling enemy ships, rescuing his companions from calamities. But though Cheap had chased a few pirates, including the one-handed Irishman Henry Johnson, who read his gun by resting the barrel on his stump, these earlier voyages had proved largely uneventful. He'd been sent to patrol the West Indies, generally considered the worst assignment in the Navy because of the spectre of disease, the Saron scourge, the bloody flux, the breakbone fever, the Blue Death. But Cheap had endured. Wasn't there something to be said for that? Moreover, he'd earned the trust of Anson and worked his way up to rest lieutenant. No doubt it helped that they shared a disdain for reckless banter, or what Cheap deemed a vapouring manner. A Scottish minister who later became close to Cheap noted that Anson had employed him because he was a man of sense and knowledge. Cheap, the once forlorn debtor, was but one rung from his coveted captaincy, and with the war with Spain having broken out, he was about to head into full-edged battle for the rest time. The conflict was the result of the endless jockeying among the European powers to expand their empires. They each vied to conquer or control ever larger swaths of the earth, so that they could exploit and monopolize other nations' valuable natural resources and trade markets. In the process, they subjugated and destroyed innumerable indigenous peoples, justifying their ruthless self-interest, including the reliance on the ever-expanding Atlantic slave trade, by claiming that they were somehow spreading civilization to the benighted realms of the earth. Spain had long been the dominant empire in Latin America, but Great Britain, which already possessed colonies along the American eastern seaboard, was now on the ascendance and determined to break its rival's hold. Then, in 1738, Robert Jenkins, a British merchant captain, was summoned to appear in Parliament, where he reportedly claimed that a Spanish officer had stormed his brig in the Caribbean and, accusing him of smuggling sugar from Spain's colonies, cut his left ear. Jenkins reputedly displayed his severed appendage, pickled in a jar, and pledged, "My cause to my country." The incident further ignited the passions of Parliament and pamphleteers, leading people to cry for blood, an ear for an ear, and a good deal of booty as well. The conflict became known as the War of Jenkins' Ear. British authorities soon devised a plan to launch an attack on a hub of Spain's colonial wealth, Cartagena. a South American city on the Caribbean. It was where much of the silver extracted from Peruvian mines was shipped in armed convoys to Spain. The British offensive, involving a massive fleet of 186 ships, led by Admiral Edward Verne, would be the largest amphibious assault in history. But there was also another, much smaller operation, the one assigned to Commodore Anson. With the warships and a scouting sloop, he and some 2,000 men would sail across the Atlantic and round Cape Horn, taking, sinking, burning, or otherwise destroying enemy ships and weakening Spanish holdings from the Pacific coast of South America to the Philippines. The British government, in concocting its scheme, wanted to avoid the impression that it was merely sponsoring piracy. Yet the heart of the plan called for an act of outright thievery to snatch a Spanish galleon loaded with virgin silver and hundreds of thousands of silver coins. Twice a year, Spain sent such a galleon. It was not always the same ship from Mexico to the Philippines to purchase silks and spices and other Asian commodities, which, in turn, were sold in Europe and the Americas. These exchanges provided crucial links in Spain's global trading empire. Cheap and the others ordered to carry out the mission were rarely privy to the agendas of those in power, but they were lured by a tantalizing prospect, a share of the treasure. The Centurion's 22-year-old chaplain, Reverend Richard Walter, who later compiled an account of the voyage, described the galleon as the most desirable prize that was to be met with in any part of the globe. If Anson and his men prevailed, if it shall please God to bless our arms, as the Admiralty put it, they would continue circling the earth before returning home. The Admiralty had given Anson a code and a cipher to use for his written communication, and an Oshal warned that the mission must be carried out in the most secret, expeditious manner. Otherwise, Anson's squadron might be intercepted and destroyed by a large Spanish armada being assembled under the command of Don José Pizarro. Cheap was facing his longest expedition. He might be gone for 3 years, and his most perilous, but he saw himself as a knight errant of the sea in search of the greatest prize of all the oceans. And along the way, he might become a captain yet. Yet if the squadron didn't embark quickly, Cheap feared the entire party would be annihilated by a force even more dangerous than the Spanish Armada, the violent seas around Cape Horn. Only a few British sailors had successfully made this passage, where winds routinely blow at gale force, waves can climb to nearly 100 feet, and icebergs lurk in the hollows. Seamen thought that the best chance to survive was during the austral summer, between December and February. Reverend Walter cited this essential maxim, explaining that during winter not only were the seas, airsa, and the temperatures freezing, there were fewer hours of daylight in which one could discern the uncharted coastline. All these reasons, he argued, would make navigating around this unknown shore most dismaying and terrible. But since war had been declared, in October 1739, the Centurion and the other men of war in the squadron, including the Gloucester, the Pearl, and the Severn, had been marooned in England, waiting to be repaired and tetted out for the next journey. Cheap watched helplessly as the days ticked by. January 1740 came and went, then February and March. It was nearly half a year since the war with Spain had been declared. Still, the squadron was not ready to sail. It should have been an imposing force. Men of war were among the most sophisticated machines yet conceived, buoyant wooden castles powered across oceans by wind and sail. Reacting the dual nature of their creators, they were devised to be both murderous instruments and the homes in which hundreds of sailors lived together as a family. In a lethal, eye-ooting chess game, these pieces were deployed around the globe to achieve what Sir Walter Raleigh had envisioned: whosoever commands the seas, commands the trade of the world. Whosoever commands the trade of the world, commands the riches of the world. Cheap knew what a cracking ship the Centurion was. Swift and stout, and weighing about 1,000 tons, she had, like the other warships in Anson's squadron, 3 towering masts with crisscrossing yards. wooden spars from which the sails unfurled. The Centurion could weigh as many as 18 sails at a time. Its hull gleamed with varnish, and painted around the stern, in gold relief, were Greek mythological gurs, including Poseidon. On the bow rode a 16-foot wooden carving of a lion, painted bright red. To increase the chances of surviving a barrage of cannonballs, the hull had a double layer of planks, giving it a thickness of more than a foot in places. The ship had several decks, each stacked upon the next, and 2 of them had rows of cannons on both sides, their menacing black muzzles pointing out of square gun ports. Augustus Keppel, a 15-year-old midshipman who was one of Anson's protégés, boasted that other men of war had no chance in the world against the mighty Centurion. Yet building, repairing, and tetting out these watercraft was a Herculean endeavor even in the best of times, and in a period of war it was chaos. The royal dockyards, which were among the largest manufacturing sites in the world, were overwhelmed with ships. Leaking ships, half-constructed ships, ships needing to be loaded and unloaded. Anson's vessels were laid up on what was known as Rotten Row. As sophisticated as men of war were with their sail propulsion and lethal gunnery, they were largely made from simple, perishable materials: hemp, canvas, and, most of all, timber. Constructing a single large warship could require as many as 4,000 trees. 100 acres of forest might be felled. Most of the wood was hard oak, but it was still susceptible to the pulverizing elements of storm and sea. Teredo navalis, a reddish shipworm, which can grow longer than a foot, ate through hulls. As Columbus lost 2 ships to these creatures during his 4th voyage to the West Indies. Termites also bored through decks and masts and cabin doors, as did deathwatch beetles. A species of fungus further devoured the ship's wooden core. In 1684, Samuel Pepys, a secretary to the Admiralty, was stunned to discover that many new warships under construction were already so rotten they were in danger of sinking at their very moorings. The average man of war was estimated by a leading shipwright to last only 14 years, and to survive that long a ship had to be virtually remade after each extensive voyage, with new masts and sheathing and rigging. Otherwise, it risked disaster. In 1782, while the 180-foot Royal George, for a time the largest warship in the world, was anchored near Portsmouth, with a full crew on board, water began ooding its hull. It sank. The cause has been disputed, but an investigation blamed the general state of decay of her timbers. An estimated 900 people drowned. Cheap learned that an inspection of the Centurion had turned up the usual array of sea wounds. A shipwright reported that the wooden sheathing on its hull was so much worm-eaten that it had to be taken and replaced. The foremast, toward the bow, contained a rotten cavity a foot deep, and the sails were, as Anson noted in his log, much rat-eaten. The squadron's other 4 warships faced similar problems. Moreover, each vessel had to be loaded with tons of provisions, including some 40 miles of rope, more than 15,000 square feet of sails, and a farm's worth of livestock: chickens, pigs, goats, and cattle. It could be earthly difficult to get such animals on board. Steers do not like the water, a British captain complained. Cheap pleaded with the naval administration to niche readying the Centurion, but it was that familiar story of wartime. Though much of the country had clamored for battle, the people were unwilling to pay enough for it, and the Navy was strained to a breaking point. Cheap could be volatile, his moods shifting like the winds, and here he was, stuck as a landsman, a pen pusher. He badgered Dockyard O'Siles to replace the Centurion's damaged mast, but they insisted the cavity could simply be patched. Cheap wrote to the Admiralty decrying this very strange way of reasoning, and O'Siles eventually relented. But more time was lost, and where was that bastard of the WAGER? Unlike the other men of war, it was not born for battle, but had been a merchant vessel, a so-called East Indiaman, because it traded in that region. Intended for heavy cargo, it was tubby and unwieldy, a 123-foot eyesore. After the war began, the Navy, needing additional ships, had purchased it from the East India Company for nearly £4,000. Since then, it had been sequestered 80 miles northeast of Portsmouth, at Deptford, a royal dockyard on the Thames, where it was undergoing a metamorphosis. Cabins were torn apart, holes cut into the outer walls, and a stairwell obliterated. The WAGER's captain, Dandy Kidd, surveyed the work being done. 56 years old, and reportedly a descendant of the infamous buccaneer William Kidd, he was an experienced seaman, and a superstitious one. He saw portents lurking in the winds and the waves. Only recently had he obtained what Cheap dreamed of, the command of his own ship. At least from Cheap's perspective, Kidd had earned his promotion, unlike the captain of the Gloucester, Richard Norris, whose father, Sir John Norris, was a celebrated admiral. Sir John had helped to secure his son a position in the squadron, noting that there would be both action and good fortune to those who survived. The Gloucester was the only vessel in the squadron, being swiftly repaired, prompting another captain to complain, "I lay 3 weeks in the dock, and not a nail drove, because Sir John Norris's son must rest be served." Captain Kidd bore his own story. He'd left behind, at a boarding school, a year-old son, also named Dandy, who had no mother to raise him. What would happen to him if his father didn't survive the voyage? Already Captain Kidd feared the omens. In his log, he wrote that his new ship nearly tumbled over, and he warned the Admiralty that she might be a crank, a ship that heeled abnormally. To give the hull ballast so the ship wouldn't capsize, more than 400 tons of pig iron and gravel stones were lowered through the hatches into the dark, dank, cavernous hold. The workers toiled through one of England's coldest winters on record, and just as the WAGER was ready to sail, Cheap learned to his dismay. Something extraordinary happened. The Thames froze, shimmering from bank to bank with thick, unbreakable waves of ice. An O'Shile at Deptford advised the Admiralty that the WAGER was imprisoned until the river melted. 2 months passed before she was liberated. In May, the old East Indiaman Nally emerged from the Deptford dockyard as a man of war. The Navy classed warships by their number of cannons, and, with 28, she was a 6th rate, the lowest rank. She was christened in honor of Sir Charles WAGER, the 74-year-old First Lord of the Admiralty. The ship's name seemed to ting. Weren't they all gambling with their lives? As the WAGER was piloted down the Thames, drifting with the tides along that central highway of trade, she oated past West Indiamen loaded with sugar and rum from the Caribbean, past East Indiamen with silks and spices from Asia, past blubber hunters returning from the Arctic with whale oil for lanterns and soaps. While the WAGER was navigating this tracé, her keel ran aground on a shoal. Imagine being shipwrecked here, but it soon dislodged, and in July the ship arrived at last outside Portsmouth harbour, where Cheap laid eyes upon her. Seamen were merciless oglers of passing ships, pointing out their elegant curves or their hideous oars. And though the WAGER had assumed the proud look of a man of war, she could not completely conceal her former self, and Captain Kidd beseeched the Admiralty, even at this late date, to give the vessel a fresh coat of varnish and paint so that she could shine like the other ships. By the middle of July, 9 bloodless months had gone by since the war began. If the squadron left promptly, Cheap was confident that it could reach Cape Horn before the end of the austral summer. But the men of war were still missing the most important element of all men. Because of the length of the voyage and the planned amphibious invasions, each warship in Anson's squadron was supposed to carry an even greater number of seamen and marines than it was designed for. The Centurion, which typically held 400 people, was expected to sail with some 100, and the WAGER would be packed with about 250, nearly double its usual complement. Cheap had waited and waited for crewmen to arrive, but the Navy had exhausted its supply of volunteers, and Great Britain had no military conscription. Robert Walpole, the country's rest Prime Minister, warned that the dearth of crews had rendered a third of the Navy's ships unusable. "Oh, seamen, seamen," "Seamen," he cried at a meeting, while Cheap was struggling with other officers to scrounge up sailors for the squadron. He received more unsettling news. Those men who had been recruited were falling sick. Their heads throbbed and their limbs were so sore they felt as if they'd been pummeled. In severe cases, these symptoms were compounded by diarrhea, vomiting, bursting blood vessels, and fevers reaching as high as 106 degrees. This led to delirium, catching at imaginary objects in the air. As a medical treatise put it, some men succumbed even before they had gone to sea. Cheap counted at least 200 sick, and more than 20 dead on the Centurion alone. He had brought his young nephew Henry to apprentice on the expedition, and what if he perished? Even Cheap, who was so indomitable, was so erring from what he called a very indifferent state of health. It was a devastating epidemic of ship's fever, now known as typhus. No one then understood that the disease was a bacterial infection transmitted by lice and other vermin. As boats transported unwashed recruits crammed together in Lethe, the men became lethal vectors, more deadly than a cascade of cannonballs. Anson instructed Cheap to have the sick rushed to a makeshift hospital in Gosport, near Portsmouth, in the hope that they would recover in time for the voyage. The squadron still desperately needed men. But as the hospital became overcrowded, most of the sick had to be lodged in surrounding taverns, which arid more liquor than medicine, and where 3 patients sometimes had to squeeze into a single cot. And Admiral noted, in this miserable way, they die very fast. After peaceful eorts to man the eats failed, the Navy resorted to what a Secretary of the Admiralty called a more violent strategy. Armed gangs were dispatched to press seafaring men into service, in effect kidnapping them. The gangs roamed cities and towns, grabbing anyone who betrayed the telltale signs of a mariner, the familiar checkered shirt and wide-kneed trousers and round hat, the ingers smeared with tar, which was used to make virtually everything on a ship more water-resistant and durable. Seamen were known as tars. Local authorities were ordered to seize all straggling seamen, watermen, bargemen, deshermen and lightermen. A seaman later described walking in London and having a stranger tap him on the shoulder and demand, "What ship?" The seaman denied that he was a sailor, but his tar-stained and tips betrayed him. The stranger blew his whistle. In an instant a posse appeared. I was in the hands of 6 or 8 and whom I soon found to be a press gang. The seaman wrote, "They dragged me hurriedly through several streets, amid bitter execrations bestowed on them from passers-by and expressions of sympathy directed towards me. Press gangs headed out in boats as well, scouring the horizon for incoming merchant ships, the most fertile hunting ground. Often, men seized were returning from distant voyages and hadn't seen their families for years. Given the risks of a subsequent long voyage during war, they might never see them again. Cheap became close to a young midshipman on the Centurion named John Campbell, who had been pressed while serving on a merchant ship. A gang had invaded his vessel, and when he saw them hauling away an older man in tears, he stepped forward and erred himself up in his place. The head of the press gang remarked, "I would rather have a lad of spirit than a blubbering man." Anson was said to have been so struck by Campbell's gallantry that he'd made him a midshipman. Most sailors, though, went to extraordinary lengths to evade the body snatchers, hiding in cramped holds, listing themselves as dead in muster books, and abandoning merchant ships before reaching a major port. When a press gang surrounded a church in London in 1755 in pursuit of a seaman inside, he managed, according to a newspaper report, to slip away disguised in an old gentlewoman's long cloak, hood and bonnet. Sailors who got snatched up were transported in the holds of small ships known as tenders, which resembled ooting jails, with gratings bolted over the hatchways and marines standing guard with muskets and bayonets. In this place we spent the day and following night huddled together, for there was not room to sit or stand separate. One seaman recalled, "Indeed, we were in a pitiable plight, for numbers of them were sea-sick, some retching, others were smoking, whilst many were so overcome by the stench that they fainted for want of air. Family members, upon learning that a relative, a son or a brother or a husband or a father, had been apprehended, would often rush to where the tenders were departing, hoping to glimpse their loved ones. Samuel Pepys describes in his diary a scene of pressed sailors' wives gathered on a wharf near the Tower of London. "In my life, I never did see such a natural expression of passion as I did here in some women's bewailing themselves, and running to every parcel of men that were brought, one after another, to look for their husbands, and wept over every vessel that went thinking they might be there, and looking after the ship as far as ever they could by moonlight, that it grieved me to the heart to hear them." Anson's squadron received scores of pressed men. Cheap processed at least 60, for the Centurion, however distasteful he might have found the press, he needed every sailor he could get. Yet the unwilling recruits deserted at the rest opportunity, as did volunteers who were having misgivings. In a single day, 30 men vanished from the 7. Of the sick men sent to Gosport, countless took advantage of the lax security to or, as one admiral put it, go as soon as they can crawl. Altogether, more than 240 men absconded from the squadron, including the Gloucester's chaplain. When Captain Kidd dispatched a press gang to end new recruits for the WAGER, 6 members of the gang itself deserted. Anson ordered the squadron to moor far enough outside Portsmouth harbour that swimming to freedom was impossible, a frequent tactic that led one trapped seaman to write his wife, "I would give all I had if it was 100 guineas if I could get on shore. I only lays on the deck every night. There is no hopes of my getting to you. Do the best you can for the children, and God prosper you and them till I come back." Cheap, who believed that a good sailor must possess honour, courage, steadiness, was undoubtedly appalled by the quality of the recruits who lingered. It was common for local authorities, knowing the unpopularity of the press, to dump their undesirables. But these conscripts were wretched, and the volunteers were little better. An admiral described one bunch of recruits as being full of the pox, itch, lame, king's evil, and all other distempers, from the hospitals at London, and will serve only to breed an infection in the ships. For the rest, most of them are thieves, housebreakers, Newgate prison birds, and the very loath of London. He concluded, "In all the former wars I never saw a parcel of turned-over men half so bad. In short, they are so very bad that I don't know how to describe it." To at least partly address the shortage of men, the government sent to Anson's squadron 143 Marines, who in those days were a branch of the army, with their own osseurs. The Marines were supposed to help with land invasions, and also lend a hand at sea. Yet they were such raw recruits that they had never set foot on a ship, and didn't even know how to a weapon. The Admiralty admitted that they were useless. In desperation, the Navy took the extreme step of rounding up for Anson's squadron 100 invalid soldiers from the Royal Hospital in Chelsea, a pensioners' home established in the 17th century for veterans who were old, lame, or in ye service of the Crown. Many were in their 60s and 70s, and they were rheumatic, hard of hearing, partially blind, so erring from convulsions or missing an assortment of limbs. Given their ages and debilities, these soldiers had been deemed unfit for active service. Reverend Walter described them as the most decrepit and miserable objects that could be collected. As these invalids made their way to Portsmouth, nearly half slipped away, including one who hobbled on a wooden ledge. All those who had limbs and strength to walk out of Portsmouth deserted. Reverend Walter noted, Anson pleaded with the Admiralty to replace what his chaplain called this aged and diseased detachment. No recruits were available though, and after Anson dismissed some of the most in-arm men, his superiors ordered them back on board. Cheap watched the incoming invalids, many of them so weak they had to be lifted onto the ships on stretchers. Their panicked faces betrayed what everyone secretly knew: they were sailing to their deaths. As Reverend Walter acknowledged, they would in all probability uselessly perish by lingering and painful diseases, and this too after they had spent the activity and strength of their youth in their country's service. On August 23, 1740, after nearly a year of delays, the battle before the battle was over with, everything being in readiness to proceed on the voyage. As an Sir of the Centurion wrote in his journal, Anson ordered Cheap to rear one of the guns. It was the signal for the squadron to unmoor, and at the sound of the blast the entire force, the men of war and an 84-foot scouting sloop, the Trial, as well as 2 small cargo ships, the Anna and the Industry, which would accompany them partway, stirred to life. Sirs emerged from quarters, boatswains piped their whistles and cried, "All hands! All hands!" Crewmen raced about extinguishing candles, lashing hammocks, and loosening sails. Everything around Cheap, Anson's eyes and ears, seemed to be in motion, and then the ships began to move too. Farewell to the debt collectors, the invidious bureaucrats, the endless frustrations. Farewell to all of it. As the convoy made its way down the English Channel toward the Atlantic, it was surrounded by other departing ships, jockeying for wind and space. Several vessels collided, terrifying the uninitiated landsmen on board, and then the wind, as cowl as the gods, abruptly shifted in front of them. Anson's squadron, unable to bear that close to the wind, was forced to return to its starting point. Twice more it embarked, only to retreat. On September 5, the London Daily Post reported that the Eat was still, waiting for a favourable wind. After all the trials and tribulations, Cheap's trials and tribulations, they seemed condemned to remain in this place. Yet on September 18, as the sun was going down, the seamen caught a propitious breeze. Even some of the recalcitrant recruits were relieved to be nearly underway. At least they would have tasks to distract them, and now they could pursue that serpentine temptation, the galleon. The men were elevated with hopes of growing immensely rich. A seaman on the WAGER wrote in his journal, and in a few years of returning to Old England loaded with the wealth of their enemies. Cheap assumed his commanding perch on the quarterdeck, an elevated platform by the stern that served as the Sirs bridge, and that housed the steering wheel and a compass. He inhaled the salted air and listened to the splendid symphony around him, the rocking of the hull, the snapping of the halyards, the splashing of waves against the prow. The ships glided in elegant formation, with the Centurion leading the way, her sails spread like wings. After a while Anson ordered a red pendant, signifying his rank as Commodore of the Eat, to be hoisted on the Centurion's mainmast. The other captains read their guns 13 times each in salute. A thunderous clapping, a trail of smoke fading in the sky. The ships emerged from the channel, born into the world anew, and Cheap, ever vigilant, saw the shore receding until, at last, he was surrounded by the deep blue sea. Chapter 2, a gentleman volunteer, by the maniacal cries of the WAGER's boatswain, and his mates summoning the morning watch, rouse out, "You sleepers, rouse out!" It was not quite 4 a.m. and still dark out, though from his berth in the bowels of the ship Byron couldn't discern whether it was day or night. As a midshipman on the WAGER, he was only 16. He was given a spot below the quarterdeck, below the upper deck, and even below the lower deck, where the ordinary sailors slept in hammocks, their bodies dangling from the beams. Byron was stuck down in the aft part of the orlop deck, a damp, airless hole devoid of natural light. The only place beneath it was the ship's hold, where dirty bilge water pooled, its foul scent harassing Byron, who slept just above it. The WAGER and the rest of the squadron had been at sea for barely 2 weeks, and Byron was still acclimating to his environs. The height of the orlop deck was under feet, and if he didn't duck, while standing he would smack his head. He shared this oaken vault with the other young midshipmen. They were each allowed a space no wider than 21 inches in which to sling their hammocks, and at times their elbows and knees jostled with the sleepers beside them. This was still a glorious 7 inches more room than was allotted to ordinary seamen, though less than what officers had in their private berths, especially the captain, whose great cabin o' the quarterdeck included a sleeping chamber, dining area, and a balcony overlooking the sea. As on land, there was a premium on real estate, and where you lay your head marked your place in the pecking order. The oaken vault contained the few items that Byron and his companions had been able to cram into their sea chests, wooden trunks that held all their possessions for the voyage. On board these boxes doubled as chairs, card tables, and desks. A novelist depicted one 18th century midshipman's berth as being cluttered with heaps of soiled clothing and plates, glasses, books, cocked hats, dirty stockings, tooth combs, a litter of white mice, and a caged parrot. The totem of any midshipman's quarters, though, was a wooden table long enough for a body to lie on. This was for amputating limbs. The berth served double duty as the surgeon's operating room, and the table was a reminder of the dangers that lay ahead once the WAGER was in battle. Byron's home would be lead with bone sores and blood. The boatswain and his mates, the town criers, continued bellowing and blowing their whistles. They moved through the decks, holding lanterns and leaning over slumbering seamen, shouting out or down, out or down. Anyone who didn't rise would have his hammock cut free from the rope suspending it, sending his body crashing onto the deck. The WAGER's boatswain, a burly Gur named John King, would not likely touch a midshipman, but Byron knew to stay clear of him. Boatswains, who were responsible for herding crews and administering punishments, including lashing the unruly with a bamboo cane, were notorious bruisers. Yet there was something especially unnerving about King. A crew member noted that King erred from so perverse and turbulent a temper, and was so abusive in speech, that we could not bear with him. Byron needed to rise quickly. There was no time to bathe, which was rarely done anyway, because of the limited supply of water, and he began to dress, overcoming whatever discomfort he felt bearing himself before strangers and living amid such squalor. He came from one of the oldest lines in England. His ancestry could be traced to the Norman conquest, and he had been born into nobility on both sides of his family. His father, now deceased, had been the 4th Lord Byron, and his mother was the daughter of a baron. His older brother, the 5th Lord Byron, was a peer in the House of Lords, and John, being the younger son of a nobleman, was in the parlance of the day an honourable gentleman. How far the WAGER seemed from Newstead Abbey, the Byron family estate, with its breathtaking castle, part of which had been built as a monastery in the 12th century. The property, totaling 3,000 acres, was surrounded by Sherwood Forest, the fabled haunt of Robin Hood. Byron's mother had etched his name and birth date, November 8, 1723, on a window in the monastery. The WAGER's young midshipman was destined to become the grandfather of the poet Lord Byron, who frequently evoked Newstead Abbey in his romantic verses. The mansion's self was vast and venerable, he wrote, adding that it left a grand impression on the mind, at least of those whose eyes are in their hearts. 2 years before Anson launched his expedition, John Byron, then 14, had left the elite Westminster School and volunteered for the Navy. This was partly because his older brother, William, had inherited the family estate, along with the mania that infected so many Byrons, one that eventually caused him to squander the family fortune, reducing Newstead Abbey to ruins. The hall of my fathers art gone to decay, the poet wrote. William, who staged fake naval battles on a lake and fatally stabbed a cousin in a sword duel, was nicknamed the Wicked Lord. John Byron had been left with few means to earn a respectable living. He could enter the church, as one of his younger brothers later did, but that was far too dull for his sensibilities. He could serve in the army, which many gentlemen preferred because they could frequently sit idly on a horse looking debonair. Then there was the Navy. in which you actually had to work and get your hands dirty. Samuel Pepys had tried to encourage young noblemen and gentlemen to think of going to sea as honourable service. In 1676, he established a new policy to make this path more attractive to privileged youths. If they apprenticed on a warship for at least 6 years and passed an oral examination, they would be commissioned as an officer in His Majesty's Royal Navy. These volunteers, who often began as either a captain's servant or what was known as a king's letter boy, were eventually rated as midshipmen, which gave them an ambiguous status on a man of war, forced to toil like ordinary seamen so they could learn the ropes. They were also recognized as officers in training, future lieutenants and captains, possibly even admirals, and were allowed to walk the quarterdeck. Despite these enticements, a naval career was considered somewhat unseemly for a person of Byron's pedigree, a perversion, as Samuel Johnson, who knew Byron's family, called it. Yet Byron was enraptured by the mystique of the sea. He was fascinated by books about sailors, like Sir Francis Drake, so much so that he brought them on board the WAGER, the stories of maritime exploits stashed in his sea chest. Yet, even for young nobles drawn to a life at sea, their sudden change in circumstances could be shocking. "Ya gods, what a difference," one such midshipman recalled. "I had anticipated a kind of elegant house with guns in the windows, an orderly set of men. In short, I expected to end a species of Grosvenor Place, oating around like Noah's Ark." Instead, he noted, the deck was dirty, slippery and wet, the smells abominable, the whole sight disgusting, and when I remarked the slovenly attire of the midshipmen, dressed in shabby round jackets, glazed hats, no gloves, and some without shoes, I forgot all the glory, and for nearly the rest time in my life, and I wish I could say it was the last, took the handkerchief from my pocket, covered my face, and cried like the child I was. Though poor and pressed sailors were given a basic set of clothing, known as slops, to avoid what was deemed unwholesome ill smells and nasty beastliness, the Navy had yet to institute ocile uniforms. Although most men of Byron's station could order Irish of lace and silk, their outers generally had to conform to the demands of shipboard life: a hat to shield them from the sun, a jacket, usually blued, to stay warm, a neckerchief to mop the brow, and trousers, that curious fashion started by sailors. These pants, like his jacket, were cut short to keep them from getting caught in the ropes, and during foul weather they were coated with protective, sticky tar. Even in these humble garments, Byron cut a striking gore, with pale, luminous skin, large, curious brown eyes, and ringlets of hair. One observer later described him as irresistibly handsome, the champion of his form. He took down his hammock and rolled it up for the day, along with his bedding. Then he hurriedly climbed a series of ladders between decks, making sure not to get lost in the interior wilderness of the ship. At last he emerged like a blackened miner through a hatch onto the quarterdeck, sucking in the fresh air. Most of the ship's company, including Byron, had been divided into 2 alternating watch parties, about 100 people in each, and while he and his group worked topside, those previously on duty were resting warily below. In the darkness, Byron heard scampering footsteps and a babel of accents. There were men from all strata of society, from dandies to city paupers, who had to have their wages garnished to pay the purser, Thomas Harvey, for their slops and eating utensils, in addition to the professional naval craftsmen, the carpenters and the coopers and the sail-makers. There were people from a dizzying array of vocations. At least one member of the crew, John Duck, was a free black seaman from London. The British Navy protected the slave trade, but captains in need of skilled sailors often enlisted free black men. Although the society on a ship was not always as rigidly segregated as its counterpart on land, there was widespread discrimination. And Duck, who didn't leave behind any written records, faced a threat that no white seaman did. If captured overseas, he might be sold into slavery. On board were also dozens of boys, some perhaps as young as 6, training to become ordinary seamen or hausseurs, and there were wizened old men. The cook, Thomas McLean, was in his 80s. Several crew members were married with children. Thomas Clark, the ship's master and chief navigator, had even brought his young son with him on the voyage. As one seaman observed, a man of war may justly be styled an epitome of the world, in which there is a sample of every character, some good men as well as bad. Among the latter, he noted, were highwaymen, burglars, pickpockets, debauchees, adulterers, gamesters, lampooners, bastard-getters, impostors, panders, parasites, ruans, hypocrites, thread-worn bukes, jacker-dandies. The British Navy was known for its ability to coalesce fractious individuals into what Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson called a band of brothers. But the WAGER had an unusual number of unwilling and troublesome crewmen, including the carpenter's mate James Mitchell. He frightened Byron even more than the boatswain King. He seemed to burn with murderous rage. Byron could not yet know for certain the true nature lurking inside his fellow seamen, or even himself. A long, dangerous voyage inexorably exposed one's hidden soul. Byron assumed his position on the quarterdeck. Those on watch did more than keep lookout. They had a hand in managing the complex ship, a leviathan that never slept and was constantly in motion. As a midshipman, Byron was expected to help with everything from trimming the sails to carrying hausseurs' messages. He quickly discovered that each person had his own distinct station, one that designated not only where he worked on the ship, but also where he stood in its hierarchy. Captain Kidd, who presided from the quarterdeck, was at the pinnacle of this structure. At sea, beyond the reach of any government, he had enormous authority. The captain had to be father and confessor, judge and jury to his men. One historian wrote, "He had more power over them than the king, for the king could not order a man to be ogged. He could and did order them into battle, and thus had the power of life and death over everyone on board." The lieutenant, Robert Baines, was second in command on the WAGER. About 40 years old, he'd served in the Navy for nearly a decade, and presented certifications from 2 former captains attesting to his abilities. Yet many of the crew found him maddeningly indecisive. Though he came from a notable family, his grandfather Adam Baines had been a member of Parliament. They repeatedly referred to him as Beans, which, whether intentional or not, seemed apropos. He and other ranking hausseurs on duty supervised the watch and made sure that the captain's orders were being followed. As navigators, Master Clark and his mates plotted the ship's course and instructed the quartermaster on the proper heading. The quartermaster, in turn, directed the 2 helmsmen who gripped the double wheel and steered. The non-seamen who specialized in trades formed their own social unit, the sailmaker mending canvases, the armorer sharpening swords, the carpenter repairing masts and plugging dangerous leaks in the hull, the surgeon attending to the sick. His helpers were known as lowberry boys for the porridge they served. The seamen, too, were separated into divisions that re-acted their abilities. The topmen, who were young and agile and admired for their fearlessness, scurried up the masts to unfurl and roll up sails and to keep lookout, hovering in the sky like birds of prey. Then came those assigned to the forecastle, a partial deck toward the bow, where they controlled the headsails and also heaved and dropped the anchors, the largest of which weighed about 2 tons. The forecastle men tended to be the most experienced, their bodies bearing the stigmata of years at sea. Crooked lingers, leathery skin, lash scars. On the bottom rung, situated on deck alongside the squawking, defecating livestock, were the wasters, pitiful landlubbers with no sea experience who were relegated to unskilled drudgery. Finally, in their own special category, were the Marines soldiers detached from the army who were equally pathetic landlubbers. While at sea, they were governed by naval authority and had to obey the WAGER's captain, but they were commanded by 2 army hausseurs, a sphinx-like captain named Robert Pemberton and his hot-headed lieutenant, Thomas Hamilton. Hamilton had originally been assigned to the Centurion, but he was relocated after he got in a knife fight with another Marine and threatened to duel him to the death. On the WAGER, the Marines mostly helped with having and hauling, and if there was ever an insurrection on board, the captain would order them to suppress it. For the ship to thrive, each of these elements needed to be integrated into one crisp organization. Insciency, missteps, stupidity, drunkenness, any could lead to disaster. One sailor described a man of war as a set of human machinery, in which every man is a wheel, a band, or a crank, all moving with wonderful regularity and precision to the will of its machinist, the all-powerful captain. In the morning hours, Byron would observe these components busily at work. He was still learning the art of seamanship, being initiated into a mysterious civilization so strange that it seemed to one boy as if he were always asleep or in a dream. Moreover, Byron, as a gentleman and a future sir, was expected to learn how to draw, fence, and dance, and to at least feign some understanding of Latin. One British captain recommended that a young sir in training bring on board a small library with the classics by Virgil and Ovid and poems by Swift and Milton. It is a mistaken notion that any blockhead will make a seaman. The captain explained, I don't know one situation in life that requires so accomplished an education as the sea, sir. He should be a man of letters and languages, a mathematician, and an accomplished gentleman. Byron also needed to learn how to steer and splice and brace and tack, how to read the stars and the tides, how to use a quadrant to X his position, and how to measure the ship's speed by casting a line ribbed with evenly spaced knots into the water and then counting the number that slipped through his hands over a period of time. One knot equaled a little more than a land mile per hour. He had to decipher a new, mystifying language, cracking a secret code, or he would be ridiculed as a landlubber. When he was ordered to pull sheets, he'd better seize the ropes instead of his bedding. He must not speak of the privy, but, rather, the head, essentially a hole on the deck through which the waste plunged into the ocean, and God forbid he should say he was on a ship rather than in one. Byron himself was baptized with a new name. The men began to call him Jack. John Byron had become Jack Tar. During the age of sail, when wind-powered vessels were the only bridge across the vast oceans, nautical language was so pervasive that it was adopted by those on terra firma. To toe the line derives from when boys on a ship were forced to stand still for inspection with their toes on a deck seam. To pipe down was the boatswain's whistle for everyone to be quiet at night, and piping hot was his call for meals. Scuttlebutt was a water cask around which the seamen gossiped while waiting for their rations. A ship was 3 sheets to the wind when the lines to the sails broke and the vessel pitched drunkenly out of control. To turn a blind eye became a popular expression after Vice. Admiral Nelson deliberately placed his telescope against his blind eye to ignore his superior's signal act to retreat. Not only did Byron have to learn to talk like a sailor and curse like one, but also to endure a punishing regimen. His day was governed by the sound of bells, which measured each passing half-hour during a 4-hour watch. A half-hour was calculated by the emptying of a sandglass. Day after day, night after night, he heard the bells tolling and scrambled to his station on the quarterdeck. His body shivering, his hands calloused, his eyes bleary, and if he violated the rules, he might be tied to the rigging or worse, ugged with the cat-o' 9 tails, a whip with 9 long lashes that cut into the skin. Byron was also learning the pleasures of life at sea. During meal times, the food, consisting largely of salted beef and pork, dried peas, oatmeal, and biscuits, was surprisingly plentiful, and he enjoyed dining in his berth with his fellow midshipmen, Isaac Morris and Henry Cozens. Meanwhile, seamen gathered on the gun deck, unhooking wooden planks that hung down from ropes from the ceiling to form tables, and sitting in groups of 8 or so. Because the sailors chose their own messmates, These units were like families, and members would reminisce and con in one another as they relished their daily ration of beer or spirits. Byron was beginning to form those deep friendships that emerged from being in such tight quarters, and he grew especially close to his messmate cousins. "I never knew a better-natured man," Byron wrote, when sober. There were other moments of merriment, especially on Sundays, when an Osa might yell, "All hands to play." A ship of war would then transform into a recreational park, with men playing backgammon and boys skylarking in the rigging. Anson liked to gamble and earned a reputation as a crafty card player, his blank eyes masking his intentions. The Commodore was also passionately fond of music, and every muster had at least a deadler or two, and sailors would do jigs and reels across the deck. One popular song was about the War of Jenkins' heir. They cut o' his ears and slit his nose. Then, with a jeer, they gave him his ear, saying, "Take it to your master," in disdain. But our king, I can tell, loves his subjects so well that he'll curb the haughty pride of Spain. Perhaps Byron's fondest diversion was sitting on the WAGER's deck and listening to the old salts tell tales about the sea. Tales of lost loves and near wrecks and glorious battles. These stories pulsed with life, the life of the teller, the life that had escaped death before and might escape it again. Swept up in the romance of it all, Byron began what would become a habit of excitedly lilling his journals with his own observations. Everything seemed the most surprising or astonishing. He noted unfamiliar creatures, such as an exotic bird, the most surprising one I ever saw, with a head like an eagle and feathers that were as black as jet and shined like the nest silk. One day Byron heard that petrifying order eventually given unto every midshipman, "Aloft you go." Having trained on the smaller mizzenmast, he now had to clamber up the mainmast, the tallest of the three, which rose some 100 feet into the sky. A plunge from such a height would undoubtedly kill him, as it had another seaman on the WAGER. A British captain recalled that once, when two of his nest boys were climbing, one lost his grip and hit the other, sending them both plummeting. They struck with their heads upon the muzzles of the guns. I was walking the quarter deck and presented with this most horrid spectacle. It is impossible to tell you what I feel on the occasion, or even to describe the general grief of the ship's company. Byron had an artistic sensibility. A friend said that he was drawn to connoisseurs, and he was sensitive about seeming like a delicate fop. Once, he told a member of the crew, "I can bear hardships as well as the best of you, and must use myself to them." Now he began his ascent. It was critical for him to climb on the windward side of the mast, so that when the ship heeled his body would at least be pressed against the ropes. He slipped over a rail and placed his feet on some ratlines, small horizontal ropes that were fastened to the shrouds, the near vertical ropes holding up the mast. Using this mesh of rope as a wobbly ladder, Byron hoisted himself upward. He went up 10 feet, then 15, then 20 v. With each roll of the sea, the mast swayed back and forth, while the ropes trembled in his hands. About a third of the way up, he came abreast of the main yard, the wooden spar that extended from the mast like the arms of a cross, and from which the mainsail unfurled. It was also where, on the foremast, a condemned mutineer got hanged from a rope, or, as the saying went, took a walk up Ladder Lane and down Hemp Street. Not far above the mainyard was the maintop, a small platform used for lookouts, where Byron could rest. The simplest and safest way to get there was to slip through a hole in the middle of the platform. Yet this so-called lubber hole was considered strictly for cowards. Unless Byron wanted to be ridiculed for the rest of the voyage and would it not be better to plunge to his death? He had to go around the rim of the platform by holding on to cables known as futtock shrouds. These cables were slanted on an angle, and as he shinned along them his body would tilt farther and farther until his back was nearly parallel to the deck. Without panicking, he had to feel with his foot for a ratline and pull himself onto the platform. When he stood on the maintop, he had little time to celebrate. The mast was not a single long wooden pole. Rather, it consisted of 3 great sticks, stacked on top of one another, and Byron had ascended only the rest section. As he continued upward, the shroud ropes converged, the gaps between them growing narrower and narrower. An inexperienced climber would fumble to end a perch for his feet, and at this height there was no longer any space between the horizontal ratlines to wrap his arm around for a rest. With the wind bow aiding him, Byron went past the main topmast yard from which the second large canvas sail was fastened, and past the crosstrees, wooden struts where a lookout could sit and get a clearer view. He kept ascending, and the higher he went, the more he felt the mast and his body lurching from side to side, as if he were clinging to the tip of a giant pendulum. The shrouds he gripped shook violently. These ropes were coated in tar against the elements, and the boatswain was responsible for making sure that they remained in good condition. Byron confronted an inescapable truth of the wooden world. Each man's life depended on the performance of the others. They were akin to the cells in a human body. A single malignant one could destroy them all. At last, nearly 100 feet above the water, Byron reached the main topgallant yard, where the highest sail on the mast was set. A line was attached to the base of the yard, and he had to shoe along it, while leaning his chest over the yard to balance himself. Then he awaited his orders to furl the sail or reef it, roll it up partly to reduce the amount of canvas spread in heavy winds. Herman Melville, who served on a U.S. warship in the 1840s, wrote in Redburn, "The rest time we reefed top sails of a dark night, and I found myself hanging over the yard with 11 others, the ship plunging and rearing like a mad horser. But a few repetitions soon made me used to it." He continued, "It is surprising how soon a boy overcomes his timidity about going aloft. For my own part, my nerves became as steady as the earth's diameter. I took great delight in furling the top, gallant sails and royals in a hard blow, which duty required 2 hands on the yard. There was a wild delirium about it, a knee rushing of the blood about the heart, and a glad thrilling and throbbing of the whole system, to lend yourself tossed up at every pitch into the clouds of a stormy sky, and hovering like a judgment angel between heaven and earth." As Byron now stood at the peak, high above all the strife on the decks below, he could see the other great ships in the squadron, and beyond them the sea, a blank expanse on which he was ready to write his own story. At Vey in the morning on October 25, 1740, 7 days after the squadron's departure from England, a lookout on the Severn spotted something in the emerging light. After the crew ashed lanterns and read several guns to alert the rest of the squadron, Byron saw it too, a jagged outline on the rim of the sea. Land ahoy! It was Madeira, an island on the northwest coast of Africa, that was known for its perennial spring climate and superb wine that seemed, as Reverend Walter noted, designed by Providence for the refreshment of the inhabitants of the torrid zone. The squadron anchored in a bay on the eastern side of the island, the expedition's last stop before the nearly 1,000-mile crossing of the Atlantic to the southern Brazilian coast. Anson ordered the crews to quickly replenish their water and wood, and to load up on copious amounts of the prized wine. He was eager to move on. He had wanted to complete the passage to Madeira in no more than 2 weeks, but because of contrary winds it had taken 3 times that. Any lingering hopes of circling South America during the austral summer seemed to evaporate. The difficulties and dangers of the passage round Cape Horn in the winter season led our imaginations, Reverend Walter confessed. Before they weighed anchor, on November 3, 2 events sent further shudders throughout the East. First, Richard Norris, the captain of the Gloucester and the son of Admiral John Norris, abruptly asked to resign his post. "Having been extremely ill ever since I left England," he wrote in a message to Anson, "I am apprehensive my constitution will not permit me to proceed upon so long a voyage." The Commodore granted his request, though he despised any lack of valor. so much so that he later persuaded the Navy to add a regulation specifying that any person found guilty of cowardice, negligence, or disaction during battle shall sue a death. Even Reverend Walter, whom a colleague described as rather a puny, weakly, and sickly man, said of fear, "Fie upon it! It is an ignoble passion, and beneath the dignity of man." Walter noted starkly that Norris quit his command. Later in the war, when Richard Norris was captaining another ship, he would be accused of betraying the greatest signs of fear by retreating in battle and ordered to face a court-martial. In a letter to the Admiralty, he insisted that he welcomed the opportunity to remove that infamy which malice and falsehood have thrown upon me. But before the hearing he deserted and was not heard from again. Norris's departure initiated a cascade of promotions among the commanding officers. The captain of the Pearl was appointed to the Gloucester, a more powerful warship. The WAGER's captain, Dandy Kidd, whom another officer described as a worthy and humane commander and universally respected on board his ship, moved to the Pearl. Taking his place on the WAGER was George Murray, a nobleman's son who had been in charge of the Trial sloop. The Trial was the one ship with an empty commanding officer's chair. There were no more captains for Anson to choose from, and a ace competition broke out among the junior officers. A naval surgeon once compared the jealous rivalries on ships to palace intrigue, where everyone is courting the favor of a despot and trying to undermine his rivals. Ultimately, Anson chose his dogged rest lieutenant, David Cheap. Cheap's luck had turned at last. The 8-gun Trial was no man of war, yet it was a ship of his own. In the Trial's muster book, his name was now enshrined as Captain David Cheap. D.I. errant captains meant D. errant rules, and Byron would have to adjust to his new commander on the WAGER. Moreover, because of the shifts, a stranger was now invading Byron's jammed sleeping quarters. He introduced himself as Alexander Campbell. Only about 15, and speaking with a thick Scottish accent, he was a midshipman whom Murray had brought from the Trial. Unlike the other midshipmen with whom Byron had become friends, Campbell seemed haughty and mercurial, lauding his status as a future Osar over ordinary seamen. He came as a petty tyrant who went about ruthlessly enforcing the captain's orders, sometimes with his estis. While the shake-up of commanders unsettled Byron and the other men, a second development was even more worrisome. The governor of Madeira informed Anson that lurking over the western coast of the island was a Spanish armada of at least massive warships, including a 66-gun man of war with some 700 combatants, a fatty 4-gunner with 100 men, and a vessel with a whopping 74 cannons and 700 gaiters. Word of Anson's mission had leaked out, a breach that was later confirmed when a British captain in the Caribbean seized a ship with Spanish documents detailing all the intelligence that had been gathered on Anson's expedition. The enemy knew everything and had dispatched the armada led by Pizarro. Reverend Walter noted that this force was intended to put a stop to our expedition, adding, "In strength they were greatly superior." The squadron waited until dark to slip away from Madeira, and Byron and his companions were ordered to extinguish lanterns on board to prevent detection. No longer were they prowling the sea in secret. They were themselves being hunted. Kiaptiar-3, the gunner on the WAGER, pounded a drum, the ominous beating to quarters, and the men and boys, whether half asleep or half-clothed, rushed through the darkness to their battle stations. They cleared the decks of loose items, anything that could splinter into lethal shards during an attack. A 14-year-old boy who served on a British man of war recalled that he had never seen a man killed before, until during a skirmish, a splinter struck a companion in the crown of the head, and when he fell the blood and brains came out, owing over the deck. The prospect of the wooden world turning into Ames was an even graver threat. The men on the WAGER led buckets with water and readied the ship's great guns. Those, too, ton iron beasts with snouts extending 8 feet or more. A single cannon required a crew of at least 6 people to unleash its destructive force. Each team member moved according to his own hidden design. The powder monkey, culled from the ranks of the boys, hurried across the gun deck to retrieve a cartridge that was being passed up from the subterraneous magazine room, where all the explosive materials were stored under lock and key. Marines stood guard. No burning candles were allowed inside. The boy collected the cartridge, which held several pounds of powder, and then scurried to his appointed gun, careful not to stumble on the tangle of men and machinery and spark an explosive re. Another member of his team took the cartridge and shoved it down the muzzle. Then a loader thrust inside an 18-pound cast iron ball, followed by a wad of rope to hold it in place. Each gun was mounted on a carriage with 4 wooden wheels, and the men, using tackles and blocks and dense cables, heaved the weapon forward until the muzzle protruded from a porthole. One after another, on both sides of the ship, the guns emerged. Tremors and topmen meanwhile tended to the sails. Unlike on a battle-ild, there was no said position at sea. A ship was always shifting with the wind and the waves and the currents. A captain had to adjust to these unpredictable forces, as well as to the movements of a cunning adversary, and all this required enormous tactical skills, the skills of an artilleryman and a seaman. In the fury of combat, with cannonballs and grape shot and musket shot and 2-foot long splinters eeing in all directions, the captain might need to hoist extra sails or lower them, to tack or jibe, to give chase or and he might have to ram his prow over an enemy ship so that his men could storm it with boarding axes and cutlasses and swords, as gunplay gave way to hand combat. The men on the WAGER worked in silence so that they could hear the orders being barked out. Prick the cartridge. Point the gun. Take your match. Fire! The head of the team, who was also the matchman, stabbed a slow, burning wick into a touch hole at the closed end of the gun, and then jumped out of the way with the rest of the crew as the ash ignited the cartridge, and the shot exploded with such force that the cannon reared violently backward until the breaching rope restrained it. If a man did not move in time, he'd be crushed. All through the ship the great guns were blazing, the 18-pound balls whirring through the air at about 200 feet per second, the smoke blinding, the roar deafening, and the deck shuddering as if the sea were boiling. Standing amid the heat and light was the WAGER's gunner, John Bulkley. He was among the few in the ship's ragtag company who seemed ready for a potential attack. But the call to arms turned out to be only a drill. Commodore Anson, after the recent intelligence about the lurking Spanish armada, had grown ever more fanatical about preparing everyone for battle. Bulkley performed his tasks with the ruthless sciency of one of his cold black guns. He was a true seaman, having served more than a decade in the Navy. He'd begun his career doing dirty chores, dipping his hands in the tar bucket and pumping the bilge, learning with the downtrodden to laugh at vindictive malice. In the words of one seaman, hate oppression, support misfortune. He worked his way up from the lower deck until, a few years before Anson's voyage, he went before a board of experts and passed an oral examination to become a gunner. Whereas the captain and the lieutenant received their commissions from the Crown and often changed ships after a voyage, the technical specialists, such as the gunner and the carpenter, were issued warrants from the Navy Board and were supposed to be permanently assigned to one vessel, making it more or less their home. They ranked below commissioned COSers, but were, in many ways, the heart of a ship, a professional corps that kept it running smoothly. Bulkley was responsible for all the WAGER's instruments of death. It was a crucial role, especially in times of conflict, and this was re-acted in the Navy's regulations. There were more articles concerned with the duties of the gunner than with those of the master, or even the lieutenant. As one commander put it, a gunner at sea ought to be skillful, careful, and courageous, for the strength of the ship is put into his hands. The WAGER was transporting munitions for the entire squadron, and Bulkeley presided over a vast arsenal that included enough gunpowder to detonate a small town. A devout Christian, he hoped one day to discover what he called the Garden of the Lord. Although the WAGER was supposed to hold Sunday religious services, Bulkeley complained that prayer had been entirely neglected on board, and that in the Navy, devotion, in so solemn a manner, is so rarely performed that I know but one instance of it during the many years I have belonged. He had brought with him a book entitled The Christian's Pattern, or a treatise of the imitation of Jesus Christ, and he seemed to approach the treacherous journey, at least partly as a way of getting closer to himself and to God. So you, erring, can make a man enter into himself. The book instructed, but in this world of temptation, the life of man is a warfare upon earth. Despite his beliefs, or perhaps because of them, Bulkeley had mastered the dark arts of gunnery and was determined to make the WAGER, to use one of his preferred phrases, the terror of all her enemies. He knew the precise point on a cresting wave when a crew should unleash He expertly mixed cartridges and packed grenades with corn powder, and when necessary, he pulled the fuses with his teeth. Most important, he earnestly guarded the munitions entrusted to him, knowing that if they fell into careless or mutinous hands, they could destroy a ship from within. A 1747 naval manual stressed that a gunner must be a sober, careful, honest man, and it seemed to describe Bulkeley exactly when it noted that some of the best gunners had come from the lowest station on board, raising themselves to preferment by pure dint of diligence and industry. Bulkeley was so skilled and trusted that, unlike most gunners on men of war, he was placed in charge of one of the WAGER's watch parties. In his journal, he wrote with a touch of pride, "Though I was gunner of the ship, I had the charge of a watch during the whole voyage." Bulkeley seemed, as a naval officer noted, an instinctive leader. Yet he was stuck in his station. Unlike his new captain, George Murray, or the midshipman John Byron, he was no silk-stocking dandy. He didn't have a baron as a father, or some powerful patron gracing his path to the quarterdeck. He might outrank Byron, and might serve as his guide on the ways of a man of war. But he was still considered socially inferior to him. Though there were instances of gunners becoming lieutenants or captains, they were rare, and Bulkeley was too blunt, too certain of himself, to utter his superiors, which he deemed a degenerate practice. As the historian N.A.M. Roger observed, in the time-honoured English fashion, the experts were kept in their place. It was the commissioned officers, educated only as seamen, who took command. Bulkeley was no doubt physically imposing. He once fought with an associate of the WAGER's bullying boatswain, John King. Aish compelled me to stand in my own defence, and I soon mastered him. Bulkeley wrote in his journal, yet there is no record of what Bulkeley looked like, whether he was tall or short, bald or thick-haired, blue-eyed or dark-eyed. He couldn't afford to have the celebrated artist Joshua Reynolds paint a portrait of him posing in a regal naval costume and a powdered wig, the way Anson and Byron and the Centurion's midshipman Augustus Keppel did. Keppel's portrait, modelled on the classical image of Apollo, depicted him striding across a beach in front of a foaming sea. Bulkeley's past, too, is largely obscure, as if dabbed in tar along with his calloused hands. In 1729 he married a woman named Mary Lowe. They had 2 children. The oldest, Sarah, was 10, and the youngest, George Thomas, was less than a year old. They lived in Portsmouth. That is about all we know of Bulkeley's early background. He emerges in our story like one of those settlers who arrives on the American frontier with no discernible history. A man to be reckoned with by his present deeds alone, yet we can glimpse some of his private thoughts, because he could write, and write well. He wasn't required, like more senior officers, to maintain a logbook, but he kept one for himself anyway. These volumes, written on thick sheets of paper with quills and ink that sometimes smudged as the ship rocked or was sprayed with seawater. were formatted in columns, under which were noted each day the direction of the wind, the ship's location or bearing, and any remarkable observations and accidents. The entries were supposed to be impersonal, as if the wild elements could be contained by codifying them. Daniel Defoe complained that sailors' logbooks were often no more than tedious accounts of how many leagues they sailed every day, where they had the winds, when it blew hard, and when softly. Nevertheless, these journals, mirroring a voyage, had an inherent narrative momentum, with a beginning, middle, and end, with unforeseen twists and turns, and some log keepers inserted personal notes. Bulkeley, in one of his journals, transcribed a verse from a poem: "Bold were the men who on the ocean rest spread the new sails, when shipwreck was the worst. More dangers now from man alone we end than from the rocks, the billows, and the wind." After a voyage, the captain of a ship turned over the requisite logbooks to the Admiralty, providing reams of information for building an empire, an encyclopedia of the sea and of unfamiliar lands. Anson and his ossirs would frequently consult the journals of the few seamen who had ventured around Cape Horn. Moreover, these logbooks of memory, as one historian coined them, created a record of any controversial actions or mishaps that occurred during a voyage. If need be, they could be submitted as evidence at courts-martial. Careers and lives might depend on them. A 19th-century treatise on practical seamanship advised that each logbook be carefully kept, and all interlineations and erasures should be avoided, as they always raise suspicion. It went on, the entries should be made as soon as possible after each event takes place, and nothing should be entered which the mate would not be willing to adhere to in a court of justice. These logbooks were also becoming the basis of popular adventure tales for the public, fueled by printing presses and growing literacy, and by a fascination with realms previously unknown to Europeans. There was an insatiable demand for the kind of yarns that seamen had long spun on the forecastle. In 1710, the Earl of Shaftesbury observed that tales of the sea were, in our present days, what books of chivalry were in those of our forefathers. The books, which stoked the fervid imaginations of youths like Byron, typically resembled the chronological format of a log, but featured more personal reaction. Individualism was creeping into them. Bulkeley did not plan to publish his own journal. The authorship of this growing body of literature was still largely limited to commanding ossirs or to men of certain standing and class. But in contrast to the trial's purser, Lawrence Millerchamp, who confessed in his journal how unequal he was to the task of writing the following sheets, Bulkeley relished recording what he saw. It gave him a voice, even if no one but him would ever hear it. One early morning in November, not long after Bulkeley and his companions had left Madeira, a lookout perched in the masthead spied a ship rising on the horizon. He sounded the alarm, "Sail ho!" Anson made sure that all of his men of war stayed close together, so they could quickly establish a line of battle. The ship spread out evenly, like an elongated chain, in order to consolidate their power and make it easier to assist any weakened link. This formation was the way to Eats usually squared O, but that would gradually change, culminating in 1805 when Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson d'd the rigid line of battle at Trafalgar to, as he put it, surprise and confound the enemy. So, they won't know what I am about. Even in Anson's time, shrewd captains often concealed their intentions, using trickery and deception. A captain might creep up in the fog and steal his opponent's wind by blocking his sails. Or he might feign distress before springing an attack, or pretend to be a friend, perhaps by beckoning in a foreign language, in order to get within point-blank range. After Anson's lookout sighted the vessel, it was imperative to determine whether she was a friend or a foe. One seaman described the protocol that ensued when an alien ship was detected. The captain rushed forward and yelled to the lookout, "Masthead there, sir!" "What does she look like?" "A square-rigged vessel, sir." The captain demanded silence fore and aft, and after a while he cried again, "Masthead there." "Sir." "What does she look like?" "A large ship, sir, standing toward us." The WAGER's officers and crew strained to make out the ship, to discern her nationality and purpose. But she was too far away, no more than a menacing shadow. Anson signalled to Captain Cheap, newly enthroned on the quarterdeck of the Speedy Trial, to give chase and gather more intelligence. Cheap and his men set with their canvas spread. Bulkley and the others waited and prepared the guns, once more in nervous expectation. That constant stress of guiding a war on a vast ocean, with limited means of surveillance and communication. After 2 hours, Cheap bore down on the ship and read a warning shot. She came about, allowing Cheap to approach. It turned out that she was merely a Dutch vessel bound for the East Indies. The men in the squadron returned to their watches, for the enemy, like the hidden power of the sea, might yet emerge on the horizon. Not long after, there came an invisible siege. Though no guns were read, many of Bulkley's companions began to collapse, as though struck by some malignant force. Boys could no longer muster the energy to climb the masts. The pressed invalids suerred the most, writhing in their hammocks, feverish and sweating, vomiting into pails or on themselves. Some were delirious and had to be watched so that they didn't stumble into the sea. The bacterial bomb of typhus, planted in the ships before they set sail, was now erupting throughout the Eat. Our men grew distempered and sickly. An officer observed, adding that the fever was beginning to reign amongst us. At least when the squadron was in England, the infected could be brought ashore to be treated. Now they were trapped on the overcrowded ships. Social distancing, had they even understood the concept, was impossible, and their lice-speckled bodies pressed against unsuspecting new victims. The lice would crawl from one seaman to another, and though their bites weren't dangerous, the traces of feces they deposited in the resulting wound were laden with bacteria. When a seaman innocently scratched the bite, the louse's saliva made it itch. He became an unwitting participant in his own bodily invasion. The pathogens entered his bloodstream like a stealth boarding party, then spread the contagion from louse to louse and into the lifeblood of the squadron. Bulkley was uncertain how to protect himself, except to devote himself even more intensely to God. The WAGER's surgeon, Henry Ettrick, set up a sick bay on the lower deck, which had more room to sling hammocks than the operating area in the midshipman's berth. When ailing seamen were shielded below decks from the adverse elements outside, they were said to be under the weather. Ettrick was committed to his patients and a capable knifeman, able to amputate a limb in a few minutes. He'd designed what he called a machine for reducing fractures of the thigh, a 15-pound contraption with a wheel and pinion, which he promised would ensure a patient recovered without limping. Despite such innovations, Ettrick and other doctors of his era had little scientific understanding of disease, and they had no idea how to stop a typhus outbreak. The Centurion schoolmaster Pascoe Thomas grumbled that Ettrick's theories of infection consisted of a vain of words with little or no meaning. Because the concept of germs had not yet emerged, surgical instruments were not sterilized, and paranoia over the source of the epidemic ate at sailors like the disease itself. Did typhus spread through the water or through dirt, through a touch or a look? One prevailing medical theory held that certain stagnant environments, like those on a ship, emitted noxious smells that caused disease in humans. Something, it was believed, really was in the air. As members of Anson's squadron became sick, the officers and surgeons roamed the decks, sneaking out potential culprits. Foul bilge, mouldy sails, rancid meat, human sweat, rotten timber, dead rats, piss and excrement, unwashed livestock, dirty breath. The fetidness had unleashed a plague of bugs, one so biblical that it was unsafe, as Millichamp noted, for a man to open his mouth for fear of having them why down his throat. Some crew members carved wooden boards into makeshift fans. These a certain number of men were employed to wave backwards and forwards in order to agitate the infected air, an officer recalled. Captain Murray and the other senior officers held an emergency conference with Anson. Bulkley was not included. There were certain rooms where he wasn't allowed. He soon learned that the officers had debated how to let in more air below decks. Anson ordered the carpenters to cut 6 additional openings in the hull of each man of war, just above the waterline. Still, the plague accelerated, with scores more infected. Ettrick and other doctors stationed in the sick bays grew overwhelmed. Tobias Smollett, whose picaresque novel, The Adventures of Roderick Random, drew on his experiences as a naval surgeon's mate during the war against Spain, wrote of an epidemic. "I was much less surprised that people should die on board than that any sick person should recover. Here I saw about 50 miserable distempered wretches, suspended in rows, so huddled upon another, and deprived of the light of the day, as well as the fresh air, breathing nothing but their own excrements and diseased bodies. As a sick patient fought for his life on the lonely seas far from home, his mates might visit him, holding a lantern over his vacant eyes and trying to cheer him up. Or perhaps, as a chaplain on a man of war described it, dropping silent tears on him, or in the most heart-rending accents calling him. One day on the WAGER, several men emerged from the sick bay carrying a long, shrouded package. It was the dead body of one of their companions. According to tradition, a body to be buried at sea was wrapped in a hammock, along with at least 1 cannonball. That when the hammock was sewn together, the nowel thread was often stitched through the victim's nose. To ensure that he was dead, the stee-inning corpse was placed on a plank and a Union Jack was draped over it, making it seem less like a mummy. Any of the deceased's personal effects, his clothes, his trinkets, his sea chest, were collected for auction to raise money for his widow or other family members. Even the most hardened seamen often erected exorbitant bids. Death is at all times solemn, but never so much so as at sea, one sailor recalled. The man is near you, at your side. You hear his voice, and in an instant he is gone, and nothing but a vacancy shows his loss. There is always an empty berth in the forecastle, and one man wanting when the small night watch is mustered. There is one less to take the wheel, and one less to lay out with you upon the yard. You miss his form, and the sound of his voice, for habit had made them almost necessary to you, and each of your senses feels the loss. The WAGER's bell tolled, and Bulkley, Byron, and the other men gathered on the deck and on the gangways and booms. The officers and crews of the other ships drew up nearby as well, forming a kind of funeral procession. The boatswain cried, "Oh, hats!" and the mourners bared their heads. They prayed for the dead, and perhaps for themselves too. Captain Murray recited the words, "We therefore commit his body to the deep." After the ag was removed, the plank was lifted up and the body slid over the railing. A splash broke the silence. Bulkley and his mates watched their companion sinking under the weight of the cannonball until he vanished, on that last unknown voyage, into the depths of the ocean. On November 16, the captains of the Anna and the Industry, the pair of cargo ships accompanying the squadron, informed Anson that they had full-led their contract with the Navy and wanted to return home, a desire no doubt heightened by the growing epidemic and the looming Cape Horn. Because the squadron lacked the space to store the 2 ships' remaining provisions, including tons of brandy, Anson decided to release only the Industry, which had not been very seaworthy. Each man of war carried on board at least 4 small transport crafts to ferry goods and people to shore or between ships. The largest was the longboat, at about 36 feet, and like the others it could be rowed or sailed. These little boats were kept strapped to a ship's deck, and to commence the hazardous process of transferring the Industry's leftover supplies, Anson's men began lowering them into the turbulent sea. Meanwhile, many of the officers and crew hastily composed missives to be sent back to England on the Industry. It could be months, if not years, before they would have another chance to communicate with loved ones. Bulkeley could let his wife and children know that, even though death had stalked the squadron across the sea, he remained miraculously healthy. If the surgeons were right, and the fever was caused by poisonous smells, why were some people on the ship affected and others untouched? Many of the devout believed that life-obliterating diseases were rooted in the fallen nature of humans, their idleness, their dissolution, their debauchery. The Rest Medical Textbook for Sea Surgeons, published in 1617, warned that plagues were God's way of cutting sinners from the earth. Maybe Anson's seamen were being smitten like the Egyptians, and Bulkeley had been spared for some righteous purpose. On the night of November 19, the transfer of the Industry's cargo was complete. Bulkeley wrote succinctly in his journal, "The Industry store, ship-parted company." Unbeknownst to him and the other members of the squadron, she would soon be captured by the Spanish. Their letters would never arrive. By December, more than 60 members of the squadron had been buried at sea. The disease, Reverend Walter reported, was not only terrible in its rest instance, but even the remains of it often proved fatal to those who considered themselves as recovered from it. For it always left them in a very weak and helpless condition. Although the Centurion's chief surgeon, the squadron's most experienced doctor, had only limited means at his disposal, he worked valiantly to save lives. Then, on December 10, he, too, succumbed. The squadron sailed on. Bulkeley scarred the horizon for South America for Terra Rama. Yet there was nothing to behold but the sea. He was a connoisseur of its varying hues and shapes. There were glassy waters and ragged, white-capped waters and brackish waters, and transparent blue waters and rolling waters and sunlit waters glittering like stars. One time, Bulkeley wrote, the sea was so crimson it looked like blood. Each time the squadron crossed a swath of the immense liquid expanse, another appeared before them, as if all of Earth had been submerged. On December 17, 6 weeks after leaving Madeira, and 3 months since their departure from England, Bulkeley glimpsed an unmistakable smudge on the horizon, a strip of land. "We saw the island of St. Catherine at noon," he wrote excitedly in his logbook. Situated just over the southern coast of Brazil, St. Catherine was under Portuguese control. In 1494, in the wake of Columbus's breakthrough voyage, Pope Alexander VI had, with an imperious wave of his hand, divided the world beyond Europe in half, bestowing the western side to Spain, and the eastern regions, including Brazil, to Portugal. Cape Horn was 2,000 miles south of St. Catherine, and with the prospect of winter still looming, Anson was anxious to press on. Yet he knew that his men needed to recuperate, and the wooden ships had to be patched up before entering hostile regions under Spanish control. As they approached the island, they could discern lush forests and mountains sliding into the sea. A branch of the Guarani Indians had once thrived there, hunting and shing, but after European explorers made contact in the 16th century, and after Portuguese settlers arrived in the 17th century, they'd been decimated by disease and persecution, that endless toll of imperialism rarely, if ever, recorded in logbooks. The island was now overrun with bandits who, according to schoolmaster Thomas, had id hither from other parts of the Brazils to shelter themselves from justice. The squadron anchored in a harbour, and Anson immediately sent ashore the hundreds of sick. Those who were set up a camp in a clearing and constructed shelters from old sails, the white canvas billowing in the breeze. While the surgeons and Lobley boys attended to the ailing, Bulkeley, Byron, and others hunted monkeys and wild boars, and what Lieutenant Philip Saumarez described as a very singular bird called the toucan, whose plumage is red and yellow, with a long beak resembling tortoise shell. The seamen also discovered an abundance of medicinal plants. One might imagine oneself in a druggist shop. The lieutenant observed in wonder. Nevertheless, the sickness did not release its grip, and at least 80 men and boys died on the island, their bodies buried in shallow, sandy graves. In a report to the Admiralty, Anson noted that since the squadron had left England, 160 of its roughly 2,000 members had perished, and the Eat had not even begun the most perilous part of the journey. Bulkeley spent Christmas on the island. 3 sailors died that day, casting a pall over the occasion, and whatever celebration occurred was so cursory that none of the men mentioned it in their journals. The next morning, they pressed on with their tasks, replenishing supplies, repairing masts and sails, washing the decks with disinfecting vinegar. Charcoal also burned inside the hulls to smoke out the proliferating cockroaches and rats, a procedure that Schoolmaster Thomas described as absolutely necessary, these creatures being extremely troublesome. On January 18, 1741, at the break of dawn, the squadron shoved for Cape Horn. Before long, the men were engulfed in a blinding squall, the rest hint of the ominous weather to come. On the trial sloop, 8 young topmen were aloft re-English sail when the mast snapped in the wind, catapulting them into the sea. 7 were rescued, Millerchamp noted, though all were cut and bruised in a most terrible manner. The 8th man had become entangled in the rope tentacles of the rigging and drowned. After the storm lifted, Bulkeley noticed that the Pearl, under the command of Dandy Kid, was nowhere to be found. "We lost sight of her," he wrote in his journal. For days he and his colleagues searched for the ship, but she was gone, along with her people. After nearly a month the worst was almost certain. Then, on February 17, a lookout spotted the ship's masts scraping the sky. Anson instructed the seamen on the Gloucester to sail after her, but the Pearl darted away as though its crew were terry-ed of them. At last, the Gloucester caught up to the Pearl, and its ossiers revealed why they'd been so wary. Several days earlier, while they had been looking for the squadron, they had detected VE men of war, one of which had hoisted a broad red pendant, signifying that it was Anson's egg ship. In excitement, the Pearl had raced toward the Eat, but while its crew was lowering a longboat to send a party to greet the Commodore, someone shouted that the pendant didn't look quite right. The ships weren't Anson's. They were the Spanish Armada led by Pizarro, who had made a replica of Anson's pendant. They came within gunshot of us when we found out the cheat, an officer on the Pearl reported. The Pearl's seamen immediately tightened their sails and tried to ease. As they were being chased, the ships against one, they began to chuck tons of supplies overboard, casks of water, oars, even the longboat, in order to clear the decks for battle and to go faster. The enemy ships with guns primed were closing in. Ahead of the Pearl, the ever-changing sea darkened and rippled, a sign the men feared of a reef lurking below. If the Pearl turned back, it would be pulverized by the Spanish. If it kept going, it might run aground and sink. Pizarro signaled for his ships to stop. The Pearl forged onward. As it crossed the rippling, the men on board braced for impact, for destruction, but there was not a jolt, not even a shudder. The water had simply been stirred by spawning she, and the ship glided over them. Pizarro's squadron resumed its chase, but the Pearl had amassed too great a lead, and that evening she escaped into the darkness. While Bulkeley and his colleagues were assessing the implications of this encounter, how would they cope with the loss of provisions? How far away was Pizarro's squadron? One of the officers on the Pearl informed Anson that something else had happened during their separation. "I regret to report to your honor," he said, "that our commander, Captain Dandy Kid, died of fever." Bulkeley had known Kid from his time on the WAGER, and he was a knee captain and a good soul. According to one officer's journal, shortly before Kid passed he had hailed his men as brave fellows and had beseeched them to be dutiful to their next commander. "I cannot live long," he muttered. "I hope I have made my peace with God." Fretting over the fate of his year-old son, who seemingly had nobody else to look after him, he composed his last will and testament, setting aside money for the boy's education and advancement in the world. The death of Captain Kidd provoked another round of changes to the captaincies. Bulkeley was told that the WAGER's recently appointed Commander Murray was being promoted again, this time to the larger Pearl. As for the WAGER, it would be getting yet another new leader, someone who had never been in charge of a man of war. David Cheap. The men wondered whether Cheap, like Captain Kidd and Commodore Anson, understood that the secret to establishing command was not tyrannizing men, but convincing, sympathizing, and inspiring them, or if he would be one of those despots who ruled by the lash. Bulkeley rarely betrayed emotion, and in his journal he coolly noted this turn of events, as if it were just another trial in that eternal warfare upon earth. As his book on Christianity asked, "How shall thy patience be crowned, if no adversity happen unto thee?" But his entry did dwell on one unsettling detail. He wrote that Captain Kidd, on his deathbed, had delivered a prophecy concerning the expedition. It would end in poverty, vermin, famine, death and destruction.